So, hello everybody, and welcome to the roundtable Teaching AI Ethics for Political Affairs. The guests are John Hooker from Carnegie Mellon University and Stefaan Verhulst from the Governance Lab at New York. I will introduce them later in great detail to you. My name is Klaus Wagner. I am a journalist for science, technology, and culture. And I do some research in AI ethics and in the AI technology field. And I got my PhD quite a few years ago. And by training, I'm a molecular biologist, but I'm highly interested in robotics and automatics and AI. And the idea to this roundtable came to me after talking to two PhD students at the Technical University, and this is namely Franziska Posler and Maximilian Geislinger, who will present their work tomorrow afternoon at 4:45. And the topic of the interview was how can autonomous cars estimate their trajectories when it comes to risky situations, and cars might be damaged and passengers might be injured. And I thought, oh, this situation reminds me on politics. You have different interests, you have different powers of political forces, and there's maybe quite a lot of imbalance, and you should find a good solution in politics, and maybe it's not always the case that there is a good solution. And before going into the details, I would like to thank all the organizers to giving me the chance to have this round table with this, I think, very hot topic. As far as I learned during the time for my preparation, ethical decision-making is a very hot focus. And to do some decision-making, we need some data. Without any data, we cannot make any decision. And for this, I would like to address Dr. Stefaan Verhulst from the Governance Lab, with a few questions about data, and I will introduce him to you. First, Dr. Verhulst is a co-founder and as well as the Chief Research and Development Officer at the Governance Lab at New York University. He did a lot of research projects, and to name only a few of these projects, he developed the ethical and policy frameworks for the responsible reuse of data, which appears not to be a trivial point. He launched the new academic journal Data and Policy and the annual conference Data for Policy. And additionally, he established the profession and the network of data stewards. And he is also co-founder and curator-in-chief of the Living Library. This is a collection of literature on various aspects of data. He is a senior fellow at the Center of Democracy and Technology at Yale University, the Central European University, and he's also an emeritus fellow at Oxford University. He taught many years at London School of Economics and serves on numerous boards and is a thought consultant by many organizations like the European Commission, the World Economic Forum, and the OECD. And on Tuesday afternoon at 2:45, he is a speaker in the panel Governing AI, the Role of Policy and Regulation. Now coming to our question, Stefaan, one of your focal points is open data, which can enhance participation in decision-making on the level of organizations and also of governments. How do you assess the quality of presently available open data for political decision-making?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Klaus, for having me, and thanks much for this kind introduction as well. And as mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GovLab, and at GovLab, our mission is to look into how do we transform the way we make decisions in society, especially focusing, of course, on how do we improve it. And by improving, we mean how do we make decisions more legitimate and effective at the same time? Because it turns out, Klaus, that one of the big challenges, especially within a democratic context, is that we really need to find out a way to not only focus on the participatory aspect, but also on how do we actually combine improved participation and increased engagement with then also coming up with better solutions and more impactful and effective ways of governing, including making it more agile, so that we're not, of course, dealing with challenges the day or anyway a month after ultimately things are happening. And that turns out to be not an easy task, because obviously we've tried anyway to be legitimate and effective in the past, and quite often it's a pendulum that we see between more democratic, less democratic kind of approaches. And from our point of view, data can actually enable us to be more legitimate and effective if we are designing the use of data, of course, well. Now, to answer your question, clearly open data and especially the having access to data is crucial for using data in decision making. Because what we have seen is that we can have long conversations about the use of data, pro and con. We can have long conversations on the use of AI, leveraging data, pro and con. But from my point of view, one of the ethical issues that is quite often ignored somehow or not discussed enough is the fact that in many cases, those that need data in order to improve people's lives as a result of improving decision making actually don't have access to the data they need. And information and data asymmetries, from my point of view, is an equally important ethical aspect than, of course, misuse of data, which obviously is a key concern. And quite often we say is that it's important to focus on the misuse of data. We also have to be really, as a society, sensitive to the misuses of data. And the misuses of data is quite often a result of actually not having access to data. And so within that context, we've been working on opening data assets, and that includes government assets, because obviously I think the rationale for opening government data assets seems to be, especially in a democratic environment, seems to be pretty well established, especially also thinking about that this is something that was funded by taxpayers' money, and as a result, it should actually be made open to everyone in society to actually leverage that data for other purposes than initially intended as well. And of course, we can discuss about how to do this in an ethical and responsible way. But at least from my point of view, opening government data assets is an important aspect in order to improve decision making also within government. We've done a lot of work, Klaus, on how data is being used for COVID-19. It turns out that a lot of the data that is being used for COVID-19 is actually data that has been released in an open format at the open data platform. And so government itself is actually a big user of open data, because typically a key challenge within government has been the stovepiping and the silos that exist across government as it relates to data. And so one of the aspects of open data is that actually, it makes government more effective, because within government, there is more information sharing, but also, and that's then the second reason why open government data is important, it provides for that level of scrutiny and transparency on what is actually the data being used for decision making, so that you have kind of an understanding on what's the quality of the data that went into decision making, what's the data that is already out there, and how do we start using the data in a way that is, of course, sensitive and legitimate as well. The second type of data assets, and then I will come back to your quality question. The second data asset from our point of view that also needs to be made more open, and by which we don't mean fully, anyway, open as in everyone can go and access it, but at least more accessible, is of course other data sets such as privately held data. And one of the big areas that we have worked on is around how do we make sure that we deal with the asymmetry of access to data that exists between the public and the private sector. Because clearly the private sector in today's data age has become a main, if not dominant, data player, which was always the government in the past, who basically was one of the dominant data players in the space, including, for instance, as it relates to weather patterns or other societal kind of issues. Now that position has been overtaken by the private sector. And so now the question is, how do we also provide access to privately held data in a way that is responsible to inform decision-making? Because it turns out that a lot of the questions that are being formulated in order to provide more legitimate and effective decision-making cannot be answered unless we actually also have access to privately held data. And that's another big area that we are working on, Klaus. Now, coming to your question, and then I will stop here. There's a lot more to be tackled, but I'm sure this is meant to be more of a conversation. Coming to your question of quality, obviously we can have a whole range of standards with regard to how do we define quality, and there is no shortage of those standards in the data management space. But from my point of view, an element of quality is related to the quality of the questions we pose as a society. And from my point of view, we cannot have a discussion about quality of data without having actually a discussion about what are the questions that matter for which we then need data for. And I've been public on set occasions where I say, like in Europe, there's a lot of discussion about high value data sets that needs to be made available for decision making. From my point of view, we need high value questions before we can even evaluate what are the high value data sets. And that's again where a participatory way to actually define the questions that matter, or in the AI context, the objectives for which we want to optimize for, we need to really establish a more participatory way to actually define the questions that subsequently can increase the quality, but also increase the democratic nature of how we are using data if we have an understanding for which we want to use it for. And I think that's quite often misunderstood from my point of view, or well understood, but not enough implemented. And that's perhaps something we can discuss about as well, Klaus.
So I agree to you that with you that is highly asking good questions is always a very tough topic, but you have a data set and you look at the data and you have to judge, is this data good enough to answer my question? And so one point is biased data. You may look at the distribution of data, and this distribution may have a certain shape. And you cannot say, data for political decision are, in my view, per se biased. It's biased by the stakeholders. And how would you as a researcher, you need some information if this has some connection to any ground truth. And how do you do that?
Well, again, it's a big question, Klaus, and there are obviously many ways of doing that. And the question is already, of course, going about what's the ground truth, and is that still based upon notions of course, population surveys, that provide us with a benchmark of reality that is being updated through census data and so on a regular basis. But I think you rightly pointed to the need to understand quality, both in terms of integrity, and again, we can have an argument about what does that mean in terms of integrity with regard to error or with regard to relevance, with regard to for what the data was collected. But I think also in terms of representativeness, especially if we start using data sets to inform decision making, if the sample is not representative, then obviously you will always have certain groups in society not being represented in the data, and as a result not being represented in the decision making process if we start using that data for. And I think we need to really think about who are the invisibles in society that we need to make more visible through data to then subsequently include that into the data sample so that we have a more representative kind of group upon which we can use data for. And clearly there are a whole range of invisibles, meaning we do a lot of work around gender, and actually in many of the data sets that we have to inform public decision making, gender is quite often absent as a variable to understand, for instance, how women and men experience mobility differently, and as a result, concerns that exist among particular kind of gender groups are not taken into account. Same thing for people that might have a certain disability. When we start using data for mobility patterns, it's important to actually have that kind of disaggregation that is quite often not present within the data, and as a result, not visible as well in how we go about making decision making. My view is that as a society, because there are other elements as well, we actually do need to start thinking about how do we develop a nutritional label for data so that we understand what is the level of bias that subsequently is in the data, but can be, of course, included in any kind of algorithmic decisions we make based upon the data, but also, with regard to relevance and what are the kinds of questions that the data can actually answer, because we shouldn't assume that all data sets, of course, are relevant and actionable given the question. And I think that's another kind of aspect that we need. And again, that kind of nutritional label, especially if we start using it for machine learning and other elements, might be important to develop. And of course, metadata is already a well-established practice, but then we need to start thinking about also how do we provide for some kind of quality of the metadata. So it's not only quality of the data that becomes important, quality of the metadata that describes the data has become equally, if not in some cases, more important as well.
And you are not afraid of being tricked in any way. Let's say, if you are asked to like something, you may like something, but the person who asks the question may order some likes. He can buy some likes. And in this way, I think data for political decision-making can also be compromised. You have some stakeholder that influences your data, and you see a totally different picture.
Yeah, no, I think that's a real, and again, there is already, as you know, a lot, and we've actually did some work recently also on the fact that we see a lot of gaming in some of those online data spaces, including, for instance, gaming with regard to submitting comments to open consultations, because as you know, one of the ways to inform the political decision-making is quite often by having public consultations. Now, the challenge of public consultations is, again, that could be gamed, and it has been gamed, and this is not new, right? It has been gamed in a variety of ways. But unfortunately, we also have seen now that actually that kind of mass submission of comments and likes and dislikes has now also become more automated. And so a key, of course, aspect of concern is to what extent, as we are seeing those kinds of online consultations, will they actually provide for a signal? Now, the other concern, by the way, Klaus, is that many of the public consultations quite often are because if they are successful and have a lot of input, key challenge has been how to make sense of them. And that's actually where some of the work we've done is actually how we can actually use advanced data analytics and even artificial intelligence to make sense of the public consultations in a better way than we've had before. So it's not only negative as well, but clearly we need to always think about what's the provenance of the data, what's the quality of the data as it relates to actually a reflection of reality. Now, if we then start comparing that with survey data, for instance, Klaus, we all know, there's a famous book, of course, that says everybody lies to survey questions. And again, I might not agree with fully that book, but we all know that surveys, right, have also and always been dependent on input and opinions that might not reflect behavior and real, we just have to look at polling data and actually real opinions in society, which is why complementing that with actually real behavioral data might actually improve the way we start thinking about what happens in society as well.
What do you think about city digital twins as data sources? So in Brooklyn, I saw there's a project at the beginning. In Munich is one, and I think this could be a quite interesting data source. Is it? Well, would it be public? Would it be available at all, or is the secrecy level too high? Are there any?
It depends on, I think, it can be made public. It depends, of course, on the kinds of data that is being used and what the licensing regimes are of the data that has been leveraged. And also, of course, depends on to what in what form can it be provided. And clearly, look, one of the big potential of data, including, of course, digital twins, is, of course, experimentation. And I think, and that's, of course, why data can be a force of good for decision making, is because we can actually experiment with different policy options prior to either scale them up or prior to even implement them in practice. And I think the digital twin, of course, is a great opportunity. And that, and again, this is not only for the public sector. Of course, digital twins are being used in private sector for a variety of aspects, including manufacturing. They're also used in the health sector more and more to actually simulate certain kinds of treatments. But in the public sector, and it's of course a lot of it is used at city level, I think that kind of opportunity to experiment and simulate certain kinds of interventions is actually a good way of decreasing uncertainty, because, as you know, the key element of decision making is basically handling uncertainty, not knowing what would work, what not works, and what's the current problem. And I think that's where data, of course, has an important role to play. Now, the key element, and again, I've given or organized a panel last week around that topic, is that it's not just good enough to have insight. You actually do need to then have a way to turn that insight into decisions. And I think too often in the data space, we are focusing on the first part. How do we go from data to insight, i.e. data intelligence? Not enough on the second part, which is how do we then turn data intelligence into decision intelligence? And what we've seen is that that kind of transition, or the last mile of actually using data for political decision-making and, of course, democratic decision-making, is quite often not well understood either. And we need to become better than just using data, like for instance in the digital twin context, using just data to present and describe what is happening. We actually do need to translate that more into then, so what are we going to do about it? And can we start using data moving forward once we have made a decision? And I think that last part of the data lifecycle, from going from insight to action, quite often gets ignored and is quite often a challenge from a capacity point of view, but also a challenge with regard to then democratic decision making, right? So how do we then decide what option should we take, and what are the values, and that's where ethics comes in, what are the values and principles that we should apply as well?
Mm-hmm. What is your notion about making synthetic data set for training of AI agents to make political decisions at all? Yeah,
again, synthetic data sets where you, anyway, well, synthetic data sets are quite often used in two contexts, right? So one is to scale up the available data for machine learning and training. And then the second one is that synthetic data is quite often used to mask certain kinds of personally identifiable information, so that you actually can use the data in a way that is privacy preserving. And I think in both contexts, of course, synthetic data has great potential, because as I already mentioned, we quite often don't have enough data in order to actually train certain kinds of algorithms in a way that makes, anyway, that provides for validity of some of the equations. But and the second environment where we actually start using synthetic data to prevent de-identification or other threats, I think that's always, of course, a good step forward. And I'm delighted to see that we actually are making some progress in using synthetic data towards those ends. The question is, of course, anyway, how far can we go? Now, the real challenge with synthetic data, and again, it's a technical, of course, challenge as well in some cases still, but I think many have become really good and have used it in successful ways, is going back to my previous comment about representation, right? And the question is, to what extent is the sample that is being developed from synthetic data, is it representative of actually reality? And how do we make sure that the sample provides for this additional level of representation? And the second challenge is that because it is automated and quite often synthetic data developed by actually algorithms themselves, we have the same problem of algorithms in general, which is the black box kind of challenge on how do we know that synthetic data actually does reflect reality, and how do we know how it was created as well. And I think those are, of course, challenges that are not, anyway, that shouldn't stop us from using synthetic data, but it's definitely something that we should be aware of moving forward if we start using the data for decision making.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Coming now closer to the AI agents, and therefore I would like to address a few questions to Professor John Hooker. John Hooker is a professor for operations research and Jerome Holloran Professor of Business Ethics and Social Responsibility at the Carnegie Mellon University. His interests include optimization, constraint programming, ethics in AI and machine learning, business ethics, and the mathematical analysis of distributive justice. He published over 200 scientific articles, 9 books, and 6 edited volumes in the field, and holds doctoral degrees in philosophy and operations research. He's a fellow of the Institute of Operations Research and the Management Sciences, Informs, and is a recipient of the Informs Computing Society Award and the Award of Lifetime Achievements in Optimization. And he also got an award from the Association of Constraint Programming. He designed the ethics program at the Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business and is founding editor-in-chief of the journal business, ethics, and education. He has been privileged to live and work in 10 centuries on 6 countries. John, coming back to synthetic data, what do you say about a synthetic data set as benchmark for training AI agents?
Okay, well, my focus has been on ethics and training machines to make ethical choices. And there's a fundamental problem with teaching a machine on the basis of data sets when it comes to ethics. And that problem is called the naturalistic fallacy. So perhaps I can illustrate that with an example. There's a famous system called the moral machine, was developed by the Media Lab at MIT. And the idea was we're going to train a self-driving car to behave ethically by crowdsourcing behavior and opinions as to how a person should behave in traffic. So this was done, collecting, survey results and so forth from thousands of people around the world, and put together a system to reflect these values. And on looking at the results, one of the leaders of this effort pointed out that, well, we have seen some very troubling conclusions from our data collection. In other words, our cars are behaving in a way that's not ethical. So the fundamental problem here is crossing what David Hume called the is-ought gap. It is attempting to infer ethical rules and principles solely from matters of fact. And that's a fundamental error. It's always necessary to have an ethical premise. And then you can apply what you know about the world through machine learning against the background of ethical principles which are independently derived. So I guess I have to say that's the problem I see in using machine learning for ethical purposes, for inferring ethical rules and ethical behavior. Machine learning is a powerful tool with legitimate purposes, but that's not one arena in which it works.
Anyway, how would you judge the method of reinforcement learning as a means of political decision making?
Well, again, the sort of learning I'm talking about is reinforcement learning. And it can be a very useful tool in decision making for gathering facts and for understanding the world, understanding empirical matters. If there's an empirical question, then teaching a machine to make predictions, for example, is a powerful tool again. But again, the ethical background must be installed independently.
But this reinforcement learning is said to have, as Heather Roth described in her essay, is said to have utilitarian features. So there you have one quality of making an ethical decision. If I understand.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So there is something called the utilitarian principle in ethics. I can talk more about this later. But utilitarian is used in 2 senses. Okay, it's what people find to be utilitarian. It's a set of circumstances that conforms with preferences. And on the other hand, it can mean what is utilitarian, what in fact promotes welfare. And so you can infer utilitarian desiderata from behavior and from people in the sense that this is what they want, this is what people prefer, so it's utilitarian in that sense. Okay, and machine learning is very good at that. But what people want or prefer, as the moral machine demonstrated, is not necessarily what they should prefer and what is really utilitarian, what really promotes welfare. So again, there's an ambiguity in the sense of the word utilitarian that we guys in ethics have to be sensitive about.
But still, there are some people who think reinforcement learning is a good tool for political decisions. And I think there are some screws on reinforcement learning where you can turn a little bit. So let's say the value function or the the goal function. Isn't this a means where you can influence decision-making with the value function?
Certainly, but as to what you value, that's an ethical choice. And the ethical choice must be made on independent grounds. Of course, the question everyone asks, okay, well, how do you do this? What are the grounds for an ethical choice other than data gathering and value alignment and so forth? Well, we can talk about that, but there is, you know, a 2,300-year-old tradition of people who have thought very hard about how to make ethical choices independently of empirical determinations.
Coming to your paper, Taking Principles Series, a hybrid approach to value alignment in AI. There you present the idea and the architecture of an agent that includes reinforcement learning, but it has a decisive extension. Could you please tell us a little bit about this architecture and what it does and how it can maybe be shaped?
Okay, so the goal here is to teach ethics to machines in some way. Okay, so what we suggest is having a bi-level system. We have two levels. On one level, we have the rule base that actually makes the decision. Okay, it actually that the machine uses as a basis for operating or driving a car or whatever. And at an upper level, we have a set of propositions that are used to evaluate the rules ethically. Okay. Now, how does this work? So first of all, the rule base consists of rules in the form of if-then statements. If this is the situation, then you do that. In other words, an action actually incorporates the reason for the action as part of the action. There's an old tradition that goes back to Immanuel Kant there, actually to Aristotle, which says that free action necessarily contains a reason for it. If there's no reason, if you can't explain, then you don't really have free action at all. So that already guarantees a level of transparency. This is called reasons responsiveness in AI. You must be able to ask the system, why did you recommend this action? And the machine must have an explanation, okay, to be an autonomous agent. And so this is not only just a practical demand, which is very important, particularly in political realm, okay, but it's a conceptual requirement for the very possibility of action. Okay, so just, you know, by paying attention to what people have said over a few hundred years, we're already incorporating transparency and reasons responsiveness. Okay, so that's the decision-making level of the system. Okay, we have these what we call action plans. You know, we have rules of action. In this case, do that. Now, how do we evaluate those rules? Well, we use ethical principles, and we believe, and we have tried to show, you can formulate ethical principles rigorously. Using the deontological tradition in ethics. Of course, this is where people are skeptical, but you know, we can defend this. And then what you do is you take each action plan and apply the ethical principles. There are three main ones that we use to generate propositions that are like in the middle, that are the result of applying the principles to the actions. Then machine learning is used to evaluate the truth of these propositions. And if they're true, then the action plan is ethical. And that evaluation is itself an empirical question, which machine learning can answer. So just make it concrete. You know, say you have a car and you'd like to pull out into a main highway, a main thoroughfare. How do you do that? So in some parts of the world, you wait for the signal to change. Okay, then you wait for a gap in the traffic. In other parts of the world, you don't do that. You simply just ease out of the traffic and everyone makes allowances. Okay, sort of one-on-one negotiation. Okay, so what should you do in a case like that? Well, first you have to understand what the norms are. This is an empirical question. What are the norms for traffic in that part of the world? Machine learning and the moral machine can answer that question. Okay, but then you have to ask, okay, once you know this, what do you do with this information? Well, you say from a utilitarian perspective, from a generalizability, which is another rule we use in ethics, then you should conform to local expectations in that case. Okay, now perhaps in other cases you should not. For example, there might be a practice of driving very quickly through a slum neighborhood because you don't really care too much about the people who live there. Okay, you endanger the children. Or perhaps there's a practice of giving of giving right of way to people who have a high status, whereas you ignore people who have low status. I've lived in parts of the world where that's done on the streets all the time. Okay, you have to make sure you see how the guy in the car is dressed, and then you give right away if he's dressed like an important person. Okay, so you might say, well, that's not something that we necessarily want to conform to, even though it may be the norm, because of the danger involved. Okay, so that's what you want to do. You apply the principles in the light of machine learned information about the situation. But both come into play.
Both come into play, and your ethical part that makes the judgment if the action plan is okay. Can you extend it in every way you think is necessary? Let's say you want to include a theory of justice, something like that, or you want to make sure that nobody's autonomy is disturbed. Can you make sure with your machine?
Okay, so the three principles that we have worked with are the generalization principle, utilitarian principle, and autonomy principle. Okay, those have long traditions. So we believe that, it's not, in fact, we don't believe it. It has been shown that you can defend these principles on the basis of reasoning from first principles. So, for example, the generalization principle says that the reasons for your actions must be such that you can rationally believe that if everyone who had the same reasons acted the same way, you could still achieve your purposes. Okay, it sounds a lot like Kantian principle, right? Categorical, but it comes out of Kant ultimately. And there's an autonomy principle, which is actually quite involved. It basically says you must respect the autonomy of others except when you have informed consent to do otherwise, or except when that person is acting unethically, and so forth. Okay. So this tradition allows us, we think, to state these principles rigorously. In fact, we use something called quantified modal logic as an idiom in which to express the principles, so we can apply them in a mechanistic way to evaluating particular action plans.
Picking up the point of biased data once again, could you imagine of a mechanism that in your design that can recognize biased data based on a known ground truth?
Okay, so this is a very much discussed problem in AI. In fact, it's almost the only problem people discuss in the ethics realm in AI. And that is, what do you do about biased data, gender bias, racially biased, and so forth and so on. This is an almost intractable problem, because even if you clean the data, you remove all traces of bias from the data, it's still latent in the data. It's still there, and the machine learning picks it up. So you will end up learning biased decisions, even though the data appear to be clean from all appearances. So there's been enormous effort devoted to try to detect this kind of bias. How do you measure it? And once you measure it, what do you do about it? How do you, tweak the learning system so as to remove the bias? This is a controversial area. No one really knows what to do, even how to measure bias. There's something like 70 ways to measure bias, and no one can really decide, which one should be used in a particular case. But that's a major problem. And simply cleaning the data, that's important, to do what, to try to collect unbiased data. That's the first step. But even once you do that, it's still hidden in the data in many cases, and you have to be aware of it and detect it, and then try to account for it.
Luciano Floridi set up, and his co-workers, there are quite a large number of authors on this paper. They established 5 principles.
Yes.
That AI agents should fulfill. And the principles are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, we talked about, justice, and explicability. Does your system fulfill these criteria? Or I think I could imagine that beneficency might be the simplest point.
Utilitarian, yes.
Yes. And what is with the other points?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So on looking over these 5 principles, it's these are covered by the ontological tradition I mentioned. It's not surprising because this is very much part of our intellectual tradition in Western civilization. So this filtered into this this discussion in that paper as well. So as you mentioned, beneficent action is a case of the utilitarian principle. Act so as to create benefit rather than harm for the most people. It can be made more precise than that. Okay, so that's, as you say, that's a clear case. So one of those principles has to do with autonomy and informed consent. This particularly comes up in a medical context. In what cases can you make a decision for someone who is incapacitated? Decisions of that kind, which is, a lot of people have thought hard about this. So we have a doctrine and a theory of what is informed consent, why is it necessary, okay, and how can you rely on informed consent without violating autonomy. And one of the insights in this area is that determining whether you have informed consent requires you to ask the question, does the person who presumably gave consent, for example, through a living will, did that person have a rationale, an intelligible rationale for that decision or for that consent? And if not, you don't have informed consent. So basically you go back to the foundations of action theory to ask the question, does informed consent exist? So I think, in fact, we use in our paper examples of that kind from medical context and making consent for others who are not capable of making decisions. We use those sorts of examples in machine learning. So that's a great case where the ethical tradition has something to say, something fairly definite to say as to how to implement that principle. And the last principle, the one about transparency, was the one I was talking about. It's important to have reasons responsiveness, as they say in the AI field, transparency as to why the machine. Well, this is not only practically important, it's part of the very theory, the concept of action, that this has to be available.
So you say in one of your papers that fully autonomous machines or AI agents, they are totally ethical. You have no problem with them. And
yes.
You would say in this case, all these 5 principles are fulfilled with a real autonomous machine?
Yeah, so the claim there is that a truly autonomous machine is necessarily ethical. Okay, autonomous in the fullest sense of the word. Because in the fullest sense of the word, autonomous means that you have a coherent rationale for your decisions. That's what makes them free decisions. There's a fully coherent rationale. Well, ethical principles are nothing more than necessary conditions for the coherency of a rationale. That's where they come from. That's the source. So if you adhere to rational reasons responsiveness fully, then you're necessarily ethical because you're a free agent. Free action is really identical with ethical action. Straying into unethical behavior on this tradition is straying into unfree action. It's abdicating one's freedom as a human being. This is what unethical action is. It's an abdication of freedom. Okay, so on that insight, it's a deep insight from ethics, that a fully autonomous being is already ethical. Yes.
So I think one point that is, in my eyes, underestimated compared with bias, this is validating a system. How would you validate your system? So so we have an AI system, and so I'll make 2 points. First, it's going to have to be a rule-based system. It's not going to be simply a neural network, deep learning, whatever. Neural network will play an important role, as I mentioned, but in order to have the transparency and the reasons responsiveness, the ethical injunctions themselves, the behavioral instructions must be in the form of rules. So the objection raised is, well, this is too complicated.
You know, life is complicated, ethics is complicated. You can't write down a set of rules that's going to cover every case. Well, the car you are driving, okay, even though it's not a self-driving car, is already governed by something like 50,000 rules. And the chips that control the car, there's already a rule base there. There's tens of thousands of rules. These have been debugged, okay? Otherwise your car would run off the road, okay? How do we do this? Well, you validate an ethical rule base the same way you validate any rule base. It's a matter, you have a beta version, right? You debug it, you have various tests, software engineering tests. So you can apply the same technology you apply to computer programming in general to validate very complex computer programs. You can do that for ethics-based rule bases. It's the same. It's the same methodology.
So as the time proceeds second by second, let's come together. Stefan, I would also like to address you. What both of you think about consequences AI agents might have on democracy? Who wants to begin?
John, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, okay. I was going to ask, but I was curious about your view on this. I can just make a couple of comments. So I think, first of all, governance and public policy issues are a step beyond ethics. I have to concede that. Ethics is an important component of public policy. But once you get into public issues, you have an element of political philosophy. And there's much less consensus there, right? There's nothing but disagreement on political philosophy. So ethics doesn't have all the answers to how to deal with democracy in our age, okay? But there's something, I think, a proper approach to AI-based ethical decision can make a contribution in at least the implementation. Because implementation of public policy is a very complicated matter, like welfare payments, tax policy, regulation, safety regulations. You know, just look at the book of safety regulations. You know, it's thousands of pages of very detailed regulations that, you know, are just not very well enforced. And very often judgment calls and decisions are required to enforce these regulations. So by developing a rigorously vetted rule base, AI-based rule base for the implementation of regulations, we would have both transparency and consistency. That would be the goal. So I think that the intellectual effort of developing an AI approach to the implementation of public policy can make an important contribution. I'd say that much. In the meantime, transparency is absolutely essential in a democratic state because there's a social contract theory, right? The state is legitimized by a social contract, which is by inherently transparent type of arrangement. We all know what we're getting into. We have to agree to it, right? So this is why there's been so much controversy on using AI for parole decisions. These AI systems make parole decisions, but there's no transparency. There's no explanation. There's no one knows what the rules are here. It's just based on previous behavior of recidivism. But this is not adequate for a social contract-based government. So there again, the reasons responsiveness idea is an essential part of, I think, applying AI in a democratic context.
Stefan, what is?
You want me to? I think I think what John outlined, of course, anyway, is a great contribution here. But I also think that we should not assume that AI and data is just a one does it only informs one stage of the governance space, such as deciding what to do or evaluating what works. I think it's important to think about the full decision life cycle, ranging from determining what are the problems that we will seek to solve, to of course ideating on what's the best way of eventually going about it, both in terms of aligned with norms, values, and priorities and principles, right? Including, for instance, human rights, which is another topic that we perhaps may want to think about as, anyway, how do we leverage, anyway, existing principles and norms in the space as well, to ultimately then, of course, implementation. And I think we're gonna have to, anyway, and become more sophisticated at what stage of the decision life cycle are we using AI for what purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Again, it goes back to, I guess, what John was referring to, is that the purpose and then the rationale that explains why we're using AI for that purpose, or why we're using certain kinds of assumptions to meet that purpose, I think is important as a way to evaluate whether what we are doing is ethical given the purpose, or whether it even is fit for the purpose. And I think having a broader conversation about purpose, having a more, anyway, deliberate discussion about what purposes are ethical and that inform actually the use of AI, and how do we even go about that. I think that's something that we need to complement the consent, because from my point of view, anyway, the discussion about informed consent, again, quite often happens without actually understanding the context in which we seek consent for. And the context should be determined in part by the purpose for which we seek to use AI and data for. And that's where I feel like we need a lot more sophistication and tools for actually determining what are the adequate purposes, and then what are then the adequate ways to meet that purpose using AI and data for. And that needs to go beyond consent. And an area that we have done a lot of work is around how do we go and leverage consent, but then also establish a social license for actually using data and AI that goes beyond individual consent, which quite often is then too, focused on individual ways of dealing with that, without understanding the social contract, as John was referring to, that needs to be taken into account in addition to the individual consent kind of mechanisms that we have.
Mm-hmm. So my idea was that AI may make politics more easier, more transparent. And we have only 3 minutes left. What do both of you think or wish that AI should take, which position should take AI in politics in the future?
John, you want
to? So originally, to add a remark, originally I thought, oh, in politics, environmental problems were put aside for economic reasons. We have to do this and we have to do this, and we have to save labor, jobs, and we cannot concentrate on environment because we need this vital metals, we need this vital metals, and we cannot raise the wages for the workers as it might be fair and just, because our economy needs this amount of money and we need this and this and this. And my hope was, or is, that AI brings a little bit more transparency and fairness into the whole business.
Well, again, going back to the notion of legitimacy here, right? And I think, typically, when we work on legitimacy, we use the typical 4 horsemen or horsewomen of establishing legitimacy, which is, of course, A, level of participation, B, level of representation, C, level of transparency, and D, level of accountability, right? And that, of course, the way those 4 principles towards establishing legitimacy are implemented, you can, decide whether, there was a certain level of legitimacy. And of course, there are other notions of legitimacy, including, of course, those that have been mandated through other processes as well. But you could say that AI, and that's what we have been also focusing on, has a role to play, and especially data has a role to play across those 4 areas. Clearly, you can understand we can use data to actually understand who needs to be part, right? Because I think quite often having some kind of a better knowledge graph on who is, what are the different kinds of stakeholders in society will allow us for better participation on who needs to be part of those that will be affected. It also can provide for better informed participation. Of course, we haven't even touched upon the whole notion of to what extent can we use data to improve the public sphere in which democratic deliberation and discussion takes place, right? And that's another big area that we need to perhaps touch on, Klaus, in another environment. But obviously, level of representation as well, and that's where the work that we've done on how do we use AI to improve collective intelligence identification. And then this thing that John was referring to on, of course, the moral machine, which is basically how do we use collective intelligence to improve artificial intelligence. I think we need to find a better way to, and a more sophistication around the intersection between AI and collective intelligence. And I think AI can actually improve collective intelligence if we are moving that forward as well. And then, of course, accountability can be more streamlined and automated as well. But then we need accountability of the machines that provide for accountability. And that's where auditability comes in as a big topic as well. But that's, anyway, in a nutshell. Now, here again, Klaus, I think we can, as I mentioned, we can improve all those 4 areas. But we also need to then start thinking about how do we do this in a way that is effective? Because one key value is also not just to be fully transparent and representative and never make a decision. It's also about how do we do this in actually an environment where trade-offs need to be made and where we actually do need to make decisions down the line.
John, could you please also add a few words?
Well, of course, we're living in an age of distrust of institution, distrust of expertise. We have Brexit, we have anti-vaxxers, irrationality in public decision-making. So fortunately, the heart and soul of ethics is reaching rational consensus. Consensus is the reason we have ethics. And to the extent that AI can be built on this foundation, then perhaps it can help guide us out of this quandary we're in now. But I think that's absolutely, in one sense, the last thing people want now is some smart system like AI telling them what to do, right? This is not what people want, at least here in the US, no. But if it's based on consensus building, as ethics in its heart and soul is, then that, I think, would have to be the solution.
This is a very interesting point, because in the German newspapers, there were lots of stories about AI that may raise fears of people concerning AI. So, oh, there is a super intelligence one day. Oh, wait a second. So there was a hard discussion in the newspapers, and also a lot of stories about super intelligent AI and this will rule the world. And I was really surprised to read that in one article that more than half of the Europeans want to replace lawmakers by AI. Aren't you surprised?
Yes.
Yeah, no, there's again, those stats have been released on several occasions, and it goes back to, of course, what John was referring to, which is the fundamental distrust that currently exists, especially distrust with regard to certain institutions and actors, such as lawmakers or journalists, for that matter, quite often are also quite low on the trust equation. And so I wouldn't take it too much seriously, because exactly if you start examining to what extent would you then trust a autonomous kind of or algorithmic decision-making process, I think many people would probably have similar kind of concerns. But I do think that it indicates that we need, that it's not just about trust. You don't get just by deliberation or even transparency, that you also actually do need to perform. And I think that's quite often what people assume, that if you leave it up to the machine, the performance will be better. But I'm not, anyway, 100% sure that that is always the case.
There is a question of Marianne, and maybe we can address this. Are we then exaggerating the problem of bias? Can this aspect be exaggerated at all? We have to be we have to pop up our eyes and have to look if there is any bias, because everybody, we are all only subjects, and to be objective is an ideal, so one cannot overestimate this problem of bias. What do you think?
I think, well, I mean, first of all, it's of course important. And again, as John said, it's a multi-layered problem, because it's not just data bias, quite often systematic bias that seeks into the, even anyway, what John was referring to in actually establishing some kind of a rational approach. But I do agree with Marianne, although that might not be what Marianne was saying, but I do agree that we need to go beyond just focusing on bias. And I think also, again, I agree with John, is that bias, anyway, there's no shortage of discussions about bias, but there are challenges across the data and AI lifecycle, right, that quite often goes beyond bias. And it starts, of course, already with, anyway, collection of data, or even formulating of the, anyway, the assumption on how the world works, that then will inform the model or inform the anyway, the algorithmic kind of approach. And it also, anyway, there's problem, as you mentioned, at the level of security of the data, and to what extent is actually the data being gamed or provided in an unauthorized way. Two challenges on how we actually use it once we have an insight or once we have an action, right, that is being recommended. And there, anyway, there are similar kind of problems there that we need to tackle. And so having a full data or AI lifecycle approach to the challenges, and bias is one part of that, but it quite often mainly is a part at the stage of analysis or the stage of optimization, I think is going to be important, so that we not just focus on bias, but also are thinking about how to design a more responsible and ethical AI approach across the life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just add something, taking advantage of my position as the one who opened the session, even though I'm not part of the panel. As you were talking, the situation reminded me of what you often get in medicine, that you have certain opportunities you never had before. And then you're required to take decisions with regard to something that you never had a chance to decide before, because the option was just not there. And that might lead to, as I said in the chat, analysis paralysis, that we end up focusing on, as it's also been said here, more issues that can't be solved anyway.
Mm-hmm. And what about my hopes that political decisions may look more just and more fair in the future? So what about putting vital aspects like environment more in the focus? What about my hopes that AI will bring us a different and maybe an advantageous situation?
Well, I think if we can improve the decision ecosystem, right, in which we actually have better data based upon, of course, anyway, an understanding of both the data and the rationale that it seeks to provide. The assumption here is that ultimately we will obviously have a better decision as a result. That, of course, remains to be seen from my point of view, because, as I mentioned, it's not because data is only one part of the decision process. There are other elements that comes into play, including an understanding of actually what does that mean, that data point mean in terms of lived experience. And I think we really need to start thinking about how do we actually translate that and get also lived experience in the decision cycle that is anyway more pronounced. And then of course, there are political values that comes into play, including political priorities when making decisions and determining what trade-offs to establish. So data is only one part, and I would almost argue if data is the only part for decision making, then anyway, we might, again, going back to what John was saying, we might actually not live in the world that we want to live, because it misses the values that we need to have, and principles, of course, that we need to have in order to determine what is the right decision and the best decision, right? And I think determining what is the right decision, that's of course where you need to have values and principles, especially principles, coming to play.
Okay. Marianne, what are your hopes with concerning AI and politics? Or what is your notion? What would you expect, or what would you?
Well, I don't. This is of course a new question for me. I think I would advise a certain use of it, but of course take into consideration that it could be biased. Now, without being, but I think it's important to think that I think a lot of political decisions are made on the bias of on the basis of gut feel, and you have to have some fairly bad data in order to be worse than gut feel.
But if this is true, then we should exchange all the politicians, because the gut feeling for a destroyed environment is obviously not there. Nobody has that.
So the aim would be to say, okay, we certainly should look after the data and make sure and take all the parameters into consideration to make them as little biased as possible, and look out for obvious traps and look out for obvious problems. Now, but I think it's important that we start using it at some stage, because there are so many decisions that are based on completely wrong information and that is why I think it's and as I said also, so in the chat, could better data also lead to decisions that you might find unfair? So for instance, you say environmental sustainability. Yes, I think some people would also say economic sustainability would require certain wage moderation. Now, this is, of course, something if you think that the wages are unfair. Now, I'm living in Germany, so of course I don't. These are good wages, but even here there are people who think that they're very unfair wages. Now, if you raise the wages, you would end up like Britain in the 60s, where they were raising the wages disproportionately compared to the compared to other European countries, for which reason it helped weakening British industry, and at the end Thatcher came and said, let's do away with the trade unions. So I don't know if that it always depends on the perspective. So
John, I'm not a philosopher, but I would say, nevertheless, I would say, from a philosophical point of view, we learn by dealing with AI about ourselves. So I give you an example of what I mean. When I was writing articles about robots and human and robot interaction, one problem was how to make a handover. So I give you my pencil and you take it. And this is a very complicated experiment. You see this when a baby learns it. And so in this way, you can interpret the whole modern technique. We do not use it only as a tool to make our lives better or easier for us, which might be not true, but we learn about ourselves. We become aware of us. How do we do things? And what would you say can we learn something about politics when dealing with AI agents and political decision making?
I think that's exactly right. In fact, I would focus on the ethics side of it. AI can be a prod for us to learn more about what ethics is and to raise our level of discourse in ethics so that we think more explicitly about what we ought to do. Our level of discourse has sunk, during my lifetime even, to a remarkably low level. We're in the age of nihilism and skepticism. And our level of ethics is gut feeling, to use the phrase that was mentioned. And if even that, as a result, we have irreconcilable polarization. Okay, the only way we can remedy this is to start taking seriously the tradition that we've already developed over a few centuries as to how to analyze and resolve ethical issues. And perhaps the necessity of doing this to build AI systems will start us thinking about how to build this system, okay, to behave ethically and what that means. What does ethical behavior mean to us? And I think that's the hope I have. AI might be a prod or an incentive to start taking ethical reasoning seriously.
Do you use it as a tool? Do you use thinking about AI as a tool to reflect on yourself, on how you do things, how you decide, how you judge if this situation is ethical or not?
I think it plays a role. I think the work I've done in AI has sensitized me to issues that I would not have thought about otherwise, and to think. And I use it in my classes, of course, in my ethics classes. I use AI as an entry point because people are willing to talk about what machines should do. They don't want to talk about what I should do, right? But in talking about machines, it's a surrogate for talking about ourselves. Right, so it's a way of addressing ethical issues without stepping on toes and and offending sensibilities because we're talking about those machines, what they should do.
What I feel really worthwhile to do, why I feel it really very important to do, to deal with ethics. This was when I read a textbook on ethics, and how close we have to consider each detail that affects a decision. You must be like a policeman. What traces are there and what influences what? And I think most politicians maybe should read textbooks on ethics.
Can I interrupt you and ask that to be the concluding sentence?
Okay.
Because I think we are we're quarter of an hour over time. I think is that correct?
I see so.
I think so too. So.
Okay.
This has been amazingly interesting. Thank you very, very much.